The conference room smelled like old wood and printer toner. It was September 14th, 2019, and Margaret Chun sat at the head of a long table, hands folded, staring at a document she'd read 17 times in the past 3 days. Across from her, her younger brother David refused to make eye contact. To her left, their sister Jennifer had her arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. The lawyer, a tired-looking man named Arthur Brennan, cleared his throat for the third time in 5 minutes. "I need to state again," he said, "that this is highly irregular. The existence of a second will, dated 6 months after the first, raises significant legal questions about your mother's intent and mental capacity at the time of execution." Margaret's voice was flat when she finally spoke. "The name," she said, "Eleanor Hastings. Who is Eleanor Hastings?" No one answered. David shifted in his chair. The sound of fabric against leather seemed too loud. Jennifer uncrossed her arms just long enough to push the document away from her, as if proximity to it was unbearable. "I've never heard that name in my life," she said. The lawyer looked down at his notes. "According to this second will, Eleanor Hastings is designated as the primary beneficiary of the estate. Approximately $1.8 million in assets, including the family home in Brookline, the vacation property in Vermont, and all investment accounts." Margaret's jaw tightened. "And us. You three are each allocated $10,000 for sentimental reasons," the will states. "The rest goes to Eleanor Hastings." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that happens when something breaks inside a room and everyone hears it. But no one wants to acknowledge what just shattered. To understand how 3 siblings ended up in that conference room, staring at a name none of them recognized, you have to go back 6 weeks, to August 2nd, 2019, to the day their mother died. Patricia Chun was 73 years old. When she passed away in her sleep at Massachusetts General Hospital, the official cause of death was cardiac arrest, secondary to congestive heart failure. She'd been in declining health for 2 years, but her death still came as a shock. 3 days earlier, she'd been lucid, talking about wanting to go home, asking about her garden. Patricia had been a careful woman. Organized, the kind of person who labeled her spice rack alphabetically and kept every receipt in chronological order. Her children expected the estate to be handled the same way. Margaret was the oldest at 51. She lived in Newton, worked as a high school principal, divorced 8 years prior. She'd been the one who managed most of Patricia's medical appointments in those final years. The responsible one, the one who called every Sunday evening without fail. David was 48. He ran a small consulting firm in Cambridge, married, 2 teenage daughters. He visited less frequently than Margaret, maybe once a month, but he'd been the one to handle Patricia's finances when she started showing signs of confusion with her bills. Jennifer was the youngest of 4. She taught her art at a community college in Providence and had always been the most distant from the family, both geographically and emotionally. She'd moved to Rhode Island 20 years ago, and the visits had become increasingly sporadic. Holidays, mostly. Sometimes, not even that. They weren't a close family, but they weren't estranged either. They existed in that middle space where affection is assumed but rarely expressed, where old resentments simmer but never quite boil over. The funeral was small. Patricia had outlived most of her friends. There were some former colleagues from the library where she'd worked for 30 years, a few neighbors. The service was brief and tasteful. Margaret handled the arrangements. David paid for most of it. Jennifer showed up late and left early. The first will reading was scheduled for August 23rd, 3 weeks after Patricia's death. Arthur Brennan had been Patricia's lawyer for almost 15 years. He'd handled her divorce from the children's father back in 1989, helped her refinance the house in 2003, and drafted her first will in 2004. That first will was exactly what the siblings expected. The estate, valued at approximately $1.9 million, was to be divided equally among Margaret, David, and Jennifer. The house would be sold and the proceeds split 3 ways. Personal items were allocated based on a handwritten list Patricia had updated regularly. Margaret would receive her mother's jewelry. David would get the antique desk from his grandfather. Jennifer was designated to receive Patricia's collection of first edition books. It was fair. It was organized. It was exactly like Patricia. Margaret remembers feeling relief when Brennan read through the document. Not about the money, exactly, but about the fact that their mother had taken care of everything. There would be no arguments, no ambiguity, just a clean division, and they could all move on. Brennan told them the probate process would take about 6 months, barring any complications. He'd filed the necessary paperwork with the court. They'd need to get the house appraised, go through their mother's belongings, decide what to keep and what to sell. They left that first meeting feeling something close to peace that lasted exactly 19 days. On September 11th, 2019, Arthur Brennan received a call from a lawyer in Portland, Maine, a woman named Diane Moss. Moss represented someone who claimed to have a more recent will, dated February 18th, 2019, 6 months after the will Brennan had on file. When Brennan called Margaret to inform her of this development, she assumed it was a scam. People try to exploit estates all the time, she said. My mother would have told me if she'd updated her will. Brennan's voice on the phone was careful. The will appears to be legitimate. It's notarized. It bears your mother's signature, and it names a different primary beneficiary. Who? Someone named Eleanor Hastings. Margaret had been standing in her kitchen when she took that call. She sat down without realizing she was doing it. I don't know who that is, she said. Neither do I, Brennan replied. But according to this document, your mother wanted her to inherit almost everything. That's how they ended up in the conference room on September 14th. Staring at a name that made no sense. Brennan had copies of both wills laid out on the table. The first will from August 2018. The second will from February 2019. Margaret, David, and Jennifer were each allocated $10,000 and described as recipients for sentimental reasons only. The language was cold, almost dismissive. David was the first to push back. This doesn't make sense. Mom was starting to decline in February. She was forgetting things, getting confused. She thought I was my father twice that month. Brennan nodded. That's going to be a central question. Just 3 pages compared to the first will's 12, but it was specific. Eleanor Hastings was named directly. The address listed for her was in Portland, Maine. The will designated her as the recipient of all real property, financial assets, and investment accounts. If we contest this will, we'll need to prove she lacked the mental capacity to execute a valid testamentary document at the time of signing. Jennifer leaned forward. So we contested. Obviously, this is fraud or coercion or something. It's not that simple, Brennan said. The will was executed in Maine, witnessed by 2 individuals, and notarized by a licensed notary public. On paper, it meets all the legal requirements. Margaret's voice was quiet. Have you contacted this Eleanor Hastings? Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first. Do it, Margaret said. I want to know who she is and why my mother gave her everything we thought was ours. Brennan made the call the next day. Eleanor Hastings answered on the 3rd ring. She sounded older, her voice rough but steady. She confirmed that yes, she knew Patricia Chun. Yes, she was aware of the will. And no, she wasn't surprised the family was contesting it. When Brennan asked about her relationship to Patricia, Eleanor's answer was brief. We were friends, she said, for a very long time. That answer raised more questions than it answered, because none of Patricia's children had ever heard their mother mention anyone named Eleanor Hastings. Not once. Not in 51 years of Margaret's life. Not in family conversations, holiday dinners, or the hundreds of phone calls that happened over decades. If Patricia and Eleanor were friends for a very long time, why had it been a secret? And why would Patricia cut her own children out of her estate to benefit a woman they'd never met? Act 2. The family mask to understand what happened. You need to understand who Patricia Chun was before she became a mother, before she became the organized, careful woman who alphabetized her spices and filed her receipts. Patricia was born Patricia Ann Morrison in 1946 in Bangor, Maine. She was the only child of Robert and Helen Morrison. Her father worked at a paper mill. Her mother was a seamstress. They were neither wealthy nor poor, existing in that solid middle ground of post-war American working-class life. Patricia was smart. Exceptionally so. She graduated high school in 1964 as valedictorian and received a scholarship to the University of Maine. She studied English literature with the intention of becoming a teacher. This is where the family's knowledge of Patricia's early life becomes vague. Margaret knew her mother had gone to college in Maine. She knew Patricia had met their father, Thomas Chun, sometime in the late 1960s. She knew they'd married in 1970, moved to Massachusetts in 1971, and that Margaret was born in 1968. Wait, Margaret was born in 1968. Her parents married in 1970. This wasn't a secret, exactly. It just wasn't discussed. Patricia had always been matter-of-fact about it. Times were different then. She'd said once, when Margaret was old enough to do the math, "Your father and I figured things out." Thomas Chun had been a structural engineer. The marriage lasted 19 years before ending in divorce in 1989. He remarried quickly, moved to Oregon, and died of a stroke in 2003. For 30 years after the divorce, Patricia lived alone in the house in Brookline. She worked at the public library. She maintained her garden. She visited her children and grandchildren with predictable regularity. She was pleasant but reserved, loving but not effusive. She had acquaintances, but no close friends that her children knew of. That part had always seemed a little sad to Margaret. Her mother's life felt small, controlled. Patricia never remarried. She never, as far as her children knew, even dated, as if Patricia had decided that a quiet, organized existence was preferable to the mess of deeper connections. Except now, there was Eleanor Hastings, a friend for a very long time. After the meeting with Brennan, the siblings did what anyone would do. They started digging through their mother's belongings. The house in Brookline was a 3-bedroom colonial that Patricia had bought after the divorce. It was neat, as expected. Every surface clean, every item in its designated place. Margaret took the bedroom. David searched the home office. Jennifer went through the living room and kitchen. They were looking for anything that mentioned Eleanor Hastings. Letters, photos, address books, any evidence of this mysterious friendship. What they found was almost nothing. Patricia's address book, a worn leather thing she'd kept for years, had no entry for Eleanor Hastings. Her photo albums, meticulously organized by year and event, showed no one who could be identified as Eleanor. Her correspondence, mostly cards from her children and grandchildren, revealed no outside friendships of note. It was as if Eleanor Hastings didn't exist in Patricia's documented life, but there were small things. Strange things. In the back of Patricia's closet, Margaret found a box of old photographs that weren't in the albums. They were loose, unorganized, which was unlike Patea. Most were from the 1960s, based on the clothing and the faded color quality. One photo showed Patricia, young, maybe 20, standing on a beach with another young woman. Both were laughing. The other woman had dark hair cut short, very different from the longer styles of the time. On the back, in Patricia's handwriting, Summer, 1966. No names, no location. Margaret stared at that photo for a long time. Her mother looked happy in it, genuinely, unreservedly happy. Margaret wasn't sure she'd ever seen her mother look that way in person. David found something odd in the office. Patricia kept meticulous financial records, but there was a gap. From January 1989 to August 1989, there were no bank statements, no receipts, no records at all. 7 months missing. 1989 was the year of the divorce. Maybe the records had been lost in the chaos of separation. Maybe Patricia had simply filed them somewhere else. But it was strange. Jennifer found a book in the living room, a first edition copy of The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith. published in 1952 under the pseudonym Claire Morgan. It was valuable, easily worth several $100s. Inside the front cover, an inscription in unfamiliar handwriting. For Patricia, may you always have the courage to choose E.N.C.M. 1967 A.H. Eleanor Hastings. So, Eleanor had existed in Patricia's life, at least as far back as 1967. The siblings compared their findings on September 18th, meeting at the house to go through everything together. Margaret brought the photograph. Jennifer brought the book. David brought a spreadsheet he'd made of Patricia's financial history, with the 1989 gap highlighted in red. They sat in the living room, the same room where they'd spent countless childhood hours, and tried to piece together a version of their mother that made sense. David spoke first. So this Eleanor person knew Mom in the 60s. They were friends. Maybe college friends. Patricia graduated in 1968. Margaret's site. This photo is from 1966. The inscription in the book is from 1967. So yes, college makes sense. Jennifer was turning the book over in her hands. But why would Mom ever mention her? I mean, if they were close enough that Eleanor is giving her first edition books with inscriptions about courage, why did we never hear about her? People lose touch, David said. Maybe they were friends back then and reconnected recently. That would explain why Mom changed the will this year. Margaret shook her head. The lawyer said Eleanor told him they'd been friends for a very long time. Not that they'd recently reconnected. A very long time. So they stayed in touch for 50 years and Mom never mentioned her once. Jennifer's voice was rising. That doesn't happen. Oh, you don't hide a 50-year friendship from your children, unless there's a reason. What reason? Dabi, ask it. That's what we need to find out. Margaret sighed. If stories like this one pull you in, subscribing means you won't miss what happens next. They decided to hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, but they needed information, and they needed it quickly. The probate court would eventually rule on which will was valid, but that process could take months or even years, especially if there was a dispute over Patricia's mental capacity. The investigator, a former police detective named Robert Kozłowski, came recommended by a friend of David's. He agreed to look into Eleanor Hastings' background and any connection to Patricia Chun. Kozłowski's initial report came back on September 25th. Eleanor Hastings was 74 years old, 1 year older than Patricia had been. She lived in Portland, Maine, in a modest apartment near the old port. She'd worked as a librarian for 40 years before retiring in 2008. She'd never married, no children, no significant criminal record, not even a parking ticket. On paper, she was unremarkable, but there was one interesting detail. Eleanor had attended the University of Maine from 1964 to 1968. The exact same years as Patricia. So they had been college friends. Kozłowski dug deeper into university records. He found dormitory assignments. In 1966, Patricia Morrison and Eleanor Hastings had been roommates in Androscoggin Hall. Roommates. Margaret felt something click into place when she read that. The photograph of two young women on a beach, Boat Lejeune, the inscription about courage. The closeness implied by a will that cut out 3 children in favor of this one person. But still, roommates 50 years ago didn't explain everything. Kozłowski's report included another detail that seemed minor at the time, but would later prove crucial. In 1989, the same year of Patricia's divorce, Eleanor Hastings had taken a 7-month leave of absence from her job at the Portland Public Library. The reason listed was personal family emergency. 7 months, the same 7 months missing from Patricia's financial records. David noticed it first. He called Margaret at 11 p.m., which he never did. Look at the dates, he said. Mom's records go dark in January 1989. Eleanor takes leave in January 1989. Mom's records pick back up in August. Eleanor returns to work in August. So they were together. During the divorce, Mom went to Maine and stayed with Eleanor. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That's a big assumption. Is it? David's voice was strained. Mom divorces Dad after 19 years. She disappears from her own records for 7 months. Her college roommate takes leave from work at the exact same time. Then Mom comes back, never remarries, never dates, and lives alone for 30 years. And now we find out she left everything to this woman. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe they weren't just roommates. The words hung in the air. Margaret didn't want to think about what her brother was implying. Not because she would have judged her mother for it, but because it meant their entire understanding of Patricia's life might have been a carefully constructed fiction. We don't know that, Margaret said finally. No. David agreed. We don't. But I think we need to talk to Eleanor Hastings. Act 3. The fracture getting Eleanor Hastings to agree to meet was harder than expected. When David called her on September 27th, she was cordial but firm. I don't think a meeting would be productive, she said. The will is clear. Your mother's wishes are documented. We just want to understand, David said. You knew our mother for 50 years, and we never knew you existed. That's hard to make sense of. There was a long pause. Then Eleanor said, Your mother had her reasons for privacy. What reasons? That's not for me to explain. Then who? David's frustration was bleeding through. She's dead. We're trying to understand who she was, and you're the only person who seems to have actually known her. Another pause. Longer this time. Fine, Eleanor said. I'll meet with you. Once. But I'm not going to justify your mother's choices. I'm not going to defend the will. And I'm certainly not going to apologize for being the person she trusted most in this world. They met on October 3rd, 2019, at a coffee shop in Portland. Margaret drove up with David. Jennifer came separately, driving from Providence. They arrived early and sat at a corner table, watching the door. Eleanor Hastings walked in at exactly 2 p.m. She was tall, even with a slight stoop to her shoulders. Her hair was white, cut short in a practical style. She wore slacks and a cardigan. She looked like exactly what she was. A retired librarian in her 70s, but her eyes were sharp. Assessing, she ordered coffee, black, and sat down across from the siblings without preamble. You have 1 hour, she said. Margaret had prepared questions, but faced with this woman, this stranger who somehow knew her mother better than she did, the words felt inadequate. Jennifer was less patient. Why did our mother give you everything? Eleanor took a sip of coffee. Because I was her family. We're her family. Jennifer sighed. You're her children. That's not the same thing. The distinction landed like a slap. David leaned forward. How long were you together? Eleanor didn't flinch. 53 years. With interruptions. Together, Margaret repeated. You mean, we loved each other. From the time we were 18 years old, until the day she died. The coffee shop noise seemed to recede. The hiss of the espresso machine. The murmur of other conversations. All of it became distant. Margaret found her voice. She was married to our father for 19 years. Yes. Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact, because in 1970, women like us didn't have many options. Patricia was pregnant with you. Your father was a good man who offered to marry her. She made a choice that she thought was right for her child. So the marriage was what? A lie. David's voice was tight. It was a compromise, Eleanor said. Patricia cared for your father. She tried to make it work. But she was never in love with him. She was in love with me. Jennifer was shaking her head. I don't believe this. I don't need you to believe it. Eleanor's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. I need you to accept that your mother lived a life you didn't fully understand because she chose to protect you from judgment and difficulty. Protect us, Margaret's voice cracked. She lied to us for our entire lives. She protected you, Eleanor repeated, in the 60s and 70s. What do you think would have happened if Patricia had lived openly with another woman? She would have lost custody of you. She would have lost her job. Your lives would have been marked by stigma and cruelty. She chose to keep you safe. The logic was sound, but it didn't make the betrayal hurt less. David pulled out a folder. He placed the photograph on the table. The one of young Patricia and another woman on a beach. "Is this you?" Eleanor picked up the photo. For the first time, her expression softened. "Yes, that's Old Orchard Beach. Summer of 1966. We'd just finished our sophomore year." She set the photo down gently. Margaret's hands were clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. "When did she see you? After the divorce?" "The 7 months in 1989, David said. She stayed with you." "Yes. The divorce was hard on her. She needed space to figure out who she was without the role she'd been playing. She stayed with me. We thought maybe we could finally be open life together, but she stopped." "But what?" Margaret asked. "But you were all still young. Margaret, you were 21. David, you were 18. Jennifer, you were 15. Patricia couldn't abandon you. We never fully stopped seeing each other," Eleanor said. "Even during the marriage, Patricia would visit Maine a few times a year. Tell your father it was to see old friends," which wasn't entirely a lie. She felt she'd already damaged you enough with the divorce, so she went back to Massachusetts. We maintained our relationship quietly. I'd visit her. She'd visit me. We talked on the phone every week. We wrote letters. "Letters," Jennifer said. "We didn't find any letters, because Patricia destroyed them." Eleanor's voice was sad. Every few years, she'd burn everything. She was terrified that if something happened to her, you'd find evidence, and it would change how you saw her. "It would have," Marguerite thought, but not in the way Patricia feared. Eleanor continued. "When Patricia got sick, 2 years ago, she asked me to come to Boston. I stayed in a hotel and visited her in the hospital. You probably saw me there and didn't think anything of it. Just another visitor." Margaret did remember an older woman she'd seen a few times in the hospital corridor. She'd assumed it was someone from the library, someone from Patricia's professional life. She'd never asked. "Why the new will?" David asked. "If you'd been together all this time, why change it 6 months before she died?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "Because she found out what you were planning." "What we were planning?" Margaret felt cold. "What are you talking about?" "In February, Patricia was having a lucid day. You," she pointed at Margaret, "were on the phone with your brother." She pointed at David, discussing putting her in a memory care facility. "You talked about selling the house to pay for it." Patricia heard the whole conversation. Margaret's stomach dropped. "We were trying to help her. She was declining. We thought you'd take control of her life," Eleanor said. "Package her up in some facility and divide her assets." She called me that night. She was devastated. She said she'd spent her whole life being controlled by other people's expectations, and she wasn't going to let it happen at the end. So she changed the will to punish us. Jennifer sighed. She changed the will to ensure her wishes were respected. Eleanor's voice was sharp now. She wanted her house to stay a house. She wanted her money to go to someone who understood what it meant to build a life in the shadows. And yes, she wanted you to know that you didn't know her as well as you thought you did. The meeting ended badly. Jennifer left first, nearly running to her car. David sat in silence for a long moment, before standing up without a word. Margaret remained at the table, staring at Eleanor. "Did she love us?" Margaret asked quietly. "Of course she did," Eleanor said. "But she also resented what you represented, the life she had to live to keep you, the person she had to pretend to be. Love and resentment aren't mutually exclusive." Margaret drove back to Boston in a daze. Everything she thought she knew about her mother had been written. Every memory now had a double meaning. Patricia's calm acceptance of the divorce, her lack of interest in dating, the way she'd always seemed most relaxed when she went on her trips to Maine, coming back refreshed but somehow sad. The way she'd always been there for her children but never fully present. On October 10th, Arthur Brennan filed a formal contest of the February 2019 will. The legal argument was twofold. First, that Patricia lacked mental capacity at the time of execution due to documented cognitive decline. Second, that there was evidence of undue influence by Eleanor Hastings. Eleanor's lawyer, Diane Moss, filed a counterclaim. She argued that the will was valid, properly executed, and reflected Patricia's true wishes. She also requested a psychiatric evaluation report from Patricia's doctor, proving her mental competency in February 2019. That report existed, and it was a problem. On February 15th, 2019, just 3 days before the new will was signed, Patricia had been evaluated by her primary care physician, Dr. Sarah Nolan. The report stated that while Patricia showed signs of mild cognitive impairment, she was fully capable of understanding legal documents and making informed decisions about her estate. The report included a note. Patient expressed clear intent to update her will, discussed her reasons. At length, she is oriented to person, place, and time. Decisional capacity intact. Dr. Nolan's report made contesting the will on grounds of mental incapacity nearly impossible, which left undue influence as the primary argument. But proving undue influence is exceptionally difficult. You have to demonstrate that the beneficiary had a relationship of trust with the deceased, that they actively influenced the decision, and that the will reflects the influencer's interests rather than the deceased's true wishes. Eleanor and Patricia's relationship was clearly one of trust. But active influence? Patricia had initiated the will change herself, according to Dr. Nolan's notes. And how could anyone prove the will didn't reflect Patricia's true wishes, when those wishes had apparently been hidden for 50 years? The legal battle was going to be expensive and uncertain. On October 18th, the siblings met again to discuss their options. They gathered at Margaret's house in Newton. The atmosphere was tense. Jennifer wanted to fight. I don't care how much it costs. She lied to us our entire lives. She doesn't get to rewrite history in death. David was more pragmatic. The lawyer says, we have maybe a 30% chance of winning. The legal fees could run to $200,000 or more. Even if we win, we'd be spending a significant portion of the inheritance on the fight. So we just let her get away with it. Jennifer's anger was palpable. Margaret had been quiet. Now she spoke. What if there's more? More what? More we don't know, Eleanor said. Patricia destroyed letters every few years, she said. Patricia kept their relationship hidden. But what if there's something else? Something that would actually prove undue influence or explain why Mom did this. Like what? David asked. I don't know, but I think we need to search more carefully. Go through everything again. Look for what we missed. They returned to the Brookline house on October 20th. This time they weren't just looking for mentions of Eleanor Hastings, they were looking for gaps. Inconsistencies. Hidden spaces. Jennifer found it. In the basement, behind old holiday decorations, there was a filing cabinet. They'd looked through it before, but dismissed it as containing old tax returns and household paperwork. Jennifer pulled it away from the wall. Behind the cabinet, tucked into a gap between the concrete wall and a support beam, was a fireproof document box. It was locked. They broke the lock with a screwdriver. Inside were letters, dozens of Tim, maybe hundreds, all from Eleanor to Patricia, spanning decades. And underneath the letters, a document that made everything infinitely more complicated. A birth certificate issued in Bangor, Maine on April 3rd, 1967. For a male infant. Mother's name, Patricia Ann Morrison. Father's name, unknown. The child's name had been left blank on the certificate. Margaret stared at the document. Her hands were shaking. Patricia had a baby in 1967. The year before Margaret was born, a baby no one had ever mentioned. Act 4. The hidden past the basement of Patricia's house became a war room. They spread the letters out on an old folding table, organized them by postmark date. The earliest was from June 1967. The most recent from January 2019, just a month before the new will. Margaret started reading chronologically. David and Jennifer joined her. The early letters were what you'd expect from young women in love. Eleanor writing to Patricia during summer break, talking about missing her, about plans for the next school year, about books and ideas and dreams. But in April 1967, the tone changed. A letter dated April 10th, a week after the birth certificate. My dearest Patricia, I wish I could be there with you. I know this is the hardest thing you've ever done, and you're doing it alone, and I hate that I can't be by your side. But you're so brave, braver than anyone I've ever known. He will have a good life. He made sure of that. Please, don't let this destroy you. Please come back to me when you're ready. All my love. E. Margaret read the letter 3 times. She had a baby, Margaret said aloud, in college, and gave him up for adoption. David was reading another letter from later that month. Listen to this one. This is from April 28th. I'm glad you're feeling stronger. I know you said you can't talk about him, that you need to move forward. But if you ever change your mind, I'm here. You don't have to carry this alone. So Eleanor knew, Jennifer aside, she was there for it. They kept reading. Over the months following the birth, Patricia's life, as reflected in Eleanor's letters, seemed to stabilize. She returned to college for her junior year. The letters became lighter again, though there was always an undercurrent of sadness. Then something changed in 1968. A letter from March 1968. Patricia, I understand you're scared, but running away isn't the answer. Thomas seems like a good man, but marrying him won't erase what happened. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. Please don't make a decision based on fear. So Patricia had gotten pregnant again. This time with Margaret, and Eleanor had tried to talk her out of marrying Thomas. Patricia clearly hadn't listened. The next letter was from October 1968, after Margaret's birth. I'm sorry I wasn't there when she was born. I know things are complicated between us now, but I want you to know I'm happy for you. You sound happy in your letter, and that's all I've ever wanted. Maybe this is the right path for you. I hope it is. The letters from the 1970s and 1980s showed the pattern Eleanor had described. Brief visits, phone calls, a hidden relationship maintained in the margins of Patricia's married life. But then, 1989, the divorce year. A letter from February 1989. You can come here. Stay as long as you need. The kids are old enough now. They'll understand. We can finally stop hiding. I know you're afraid, but Patricia, we're not 20 years old anymore. How much more time are we going to waste pretending? And Patricia's response, found in a draft written on the back of an envelope. I can't. They're not ready. I'm not ready. I need time to figure out who I am outside of being a wife and mother. Can you give me that? Can you wait a little longer? Eleanor had waited for another 30 years. The letters from the 1990s onward were heartbreaking. Eleanor writing about her life in Portland, always with an undercurrent of longing. Patricia presumably writing back, though those letters weren't in the box. Then, in 2017, when Patricia's health started declining, the letters became more urgent. A letter from November 2017. I'm coming to Boston. You need someone who loves you, taking care of the medical decisions. Your children are good people, but they don't understand you. They can't make the choices you'd want. Please, let me help. And from June 2018. I know you don't want to burden me, but Patricia, you're not a burden. You've never been a burden. I've waited 50 years to take care of you openly. Please, stop pushing me away. The final letter, dated January 2019, was brief. I'm glad you're changing the will. It's the right thing to do. Not because I need the money. I don't. But because it's the first honest thing you've done in public in 50 years. I'm proud of you. Margaret set down the last letter. The timeline was clear now. Patricia had gotten pregnant in college in 1966, given birth to a son in April 1967, given him up for adoption, gotten pregnant again in 1968, this time with Margaret. Married Thomas Chun, lived a conventional life for 19 years while maintaining a hidden relationship with Eleanor. Divorced in 1989, but chose to stay closeted to protect her children. Lived quietly for 3 more decades. Changed her will near the end of her life, finally making one public choice that reflected her true self. It was logical. It was heartbreaking, but it still didn't explain everything. David was the one who asked the question. They were all thinking. The son she gave up in 1967. Do you think she ever had contact with him? Jennifer shook her head. The letter from Eleanor says he'll have a good life. That sounds like a closed adoption. She probably never saw him again. Margaret wasn't so sure. She was looking at the birth certificate again. Something about it bothered her. The certificate listed the birth as occurring at Eastern Maine Medical Center. Mother's name, Patricia Ann Morrison. Father's name, unknown. The infant's name was blank, but there was a number, a case number, at the top of the document, and a stamp that said Adoption Records, State of Maine. This isn't the original birth certificate, Margaret had sighed. This is from Adoption Records, which means Patricia requested it at some point after the adoption. When? David asked. Margaret looked at the faded stamp. It was hard to read, but she could make out part of a date. 1988. 1988. The year before the divorce. Why would Patricia request her son's adoption records the year before she left her husband? They needed more information. David called Robert Kozłowski, the private investigator. He explained about the discovered birth certificate and asked if Kozłowski could track down adoption records from 1967. Kozłowski was blunt. Maine sealed adoption records from that era. Unless the adopted child petitioned to open them as an adult, or there's a court order, they're locked. Is there any way to find out if someone petitioned to open them? Maybe. Give me a few days. Those few days felt like weeks. The siblings were in a strange limbo. They couldn't move forward with the will contest without more information, but they also couldn't stop thinking about this unknown brother, this secret child their mother had given away. Jennifer expressed what they were all feeling. Do you think he's alive? Do you think he ever tried to find her? Margaret had wondered the same thing. Adoption reunions happened. Adult children searched for birth parents all the time. On October 29th, Kozłowski called back. I found something, he said. In 1988, the Maine Adoption Registry had a petition filed to open records for an adoption that took place in April 1967 at Eastern Maine Medical Center. The birth mother was listed as Patricia Morrison. Who filed the petition? David asked. The adopted child, he would have been 21 at the time, old enough to legally access his records. Did the petition go through? Yes. Records were opened in December 1988, which means the adoptee received information about his birth mother, including her name. Margaret felt the pieces clicking together. So in 1988, Patricia's son found her, or at least found out who she was. It's more than that, Kozłowski said. I did some cross-referencing. I looked for males born in April 1967 in Maine who might have been adopted. Then looked for any connection to Patricia Chun in Moscow. Did you find anything? Maybe. There's a man named Daniel Westbrook, born April 2nd, 1967, in Bend. He lived in Portland, Maine until 2015, then moved to the Boston area, specifically to Brookline. Brookline, Jennifer repeated. That's where Mom lived, right? And here's where it gets interesting. Daniel Westbrook worked as an estate planning attorney. His office was 3 blocks from Patricia Chun's house. The room went silent. An estate planning attorney in Brookline. 3 blocks from their mother's house, Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Do you think he helped her write the will? I think it's worth finding out, Kozłowski said. They found Daniel Westbrook's office, Isilla. It was in a renovated brownstone on Harvard Street. Margaret called him, made an appointment, claiming to need estate planning services. The appointment was set for November 1st. Margaret went alone. She didn't tell the receptionist who she was, or why she was really there. Daniel Westbrook was 52 years old, tall, with graying hair and kind eyes. He welcomed Margaret into his office with a professional smile. "Thank you for seeing me," Margaret sighed. "I need help with my mother's estate." Something in her voice must have conveyed more than her words. Daniel's smile faded slightly. "Of course. What's the situation?" Margaret took a breath. "My mother recently passed away. She left a will that has some complications. I'm trying to understand her intentions." "I'm sorry for your loss." Daniel's tone was genuinely sympathetic. "What kind of complications?" "She left most of her estate to someone outside the family. Someone we didn't know about. And I'm wondering if you can help me understand why." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was your mother's name?" "Patricia Chun." The change in Daniel's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. Recognition. Grief. Something else Margaret couldn't identify. "You're Margaret," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Daniel stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the street for a long moment. When he turned back, his face was composed, but his eyes were wet. "She told me about you," he said. "She told me about all three of you." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "You're him. You're her son." "I was," Daniel said quietly. "I am." The conversation that followed was difficult and strange and necessary. Daniel explained that he'd been adopted by a couple in Bangor, Richard and Susan Westbrook. They'd been good parents. Loving. He'd had a happy childhood, but when he turned 21, he'd wanted to know where he came from. It wasn't about replacing his adoptive parents. It was about completing the picture of himself. He'd petitioned to open his adoption records in 1988. He'd learned his birth mother's name was Patricia Morrison. With some research, he'd found that she'd married and was living in Massachusetts under the name Patricia Chun. "Did you contact her?" Margot asked. "Not right away. I spent a few months thinking about it, wondering if she'd want to hear from me. But eventually, I wrote her a letter. In January 1989, the timing clicked. Patricia received a letter from the son she'd given up, and a month later, she filed for divorce. She wrote back," Daniel continued. "We started corresponding. She explained that she'd given me up because she was 18 and unmarried and terrified. She said she'd thought about me every day for 21 years. Did you meet?" "Eventually. Not until 1995. We wanted to be careful. She had 3 other children, and she wasn't sure how to explain me. So we met in secret. Had coffee. Talked for hours." Margaret tried to imagine her mother sitting across from this man, this son she'd given away, trying to rebuild something that had been severed at birth. "What was she like?" Margaret asked. "When you talked to her, she was sad," Daniel said. "She kept apologizing. I kept telling her there was nothing to apologize for, but she couldn't seem to accept that. She said giving me up was the right decision for both of us, but it had broken something in her." Over the years, Daniel and Patricia had maintained contact, always quietly. He'd visit her a few times a year. They'd have lunch or coffee. They'd talk about his work, his life. He'd gotten married in 2002. Had 2 daughters. Patricia had been overjoyed to hear about her granddaughters, even though she couldn't publicly acknowledge them. "When did you tell her about Eleanor?" Margaret asked. Daniel looked confused. "I didn't tell her about Eleanor. She told me. She said Eleanor was the person who'd been with her when I was born, the only person who knew the whole truth." "So you knew about their relationship?" "Yes. She told me in 1998. She said if I was going to know her, I needed to know all of her, not just the parts she showed the world." Margaret felt a strange mixture of jealousy and gratitude. This man, this stranger, had known their mother in a way her own children never had. "The will," Margaret said. "Did you help her write it?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. She came to me in February of last year. She said she wanted to change her estate plan. She was very clear about what she wanted, which was to cut us out, which was to leave the bulk of her estate to the person who'd loved her longest and understood her best. "You mean Eleanor?" "Yes." Margaret felt anger rising. "You convinced her to disinherit her own children?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "I advised her on the legal implications. I told her that what she was planning would likely lead to a contest. I suggested she might want to include a letter explaining her reasoning. She refused. She said if you didn't understand her by then, a letter wouldn't help." "We didn't understand her." Margaret sighed, "because she never let us." "I know," Daniel said quietly. She knew that too. It haunted her. They sat in silence. Finally, Margaret asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Are you named in the will?" "No," she offered. "I refused." "I have my own life. My own family. I didn't need her money. I just needed to know her." The irony was crushing. The son Patricia gave away wanted nothing from her estate. The children she raised felt entitled to it. Who was right? Margaret left Daniel's office with more questions than answers. She called David and Jennifer and told them everything. Their reactions were different. David was thoughtful, so Mom had 4 children, not 3, and she kept one of them secret to protect us from knowing she'd had a child out of wedlock in the 60s. That's almost understandable. Jennifer was furious. She built her entire life on secrets. She married a man she didn't love. She hid who she really was. She had a secret son and a secret lover. And then she died and left us to figure out the pieces. Margaret was somewhere in between. She understood why Patricia had made the choices she'd made. The world Patricia had grown up in didn't offer many options for a pregnant, unmarried woman in 1967, or a gay woman trying to raise children in the 1970s. But understanding didn't erase the hurt. Act 5. The collapse. The will contest was scheduled for a hearing on November 15th. Both sides had submitted briefs. The siblings' argument rested on undue influence, claiming Eleanor had manipulated Patricia during a period of cognitive decline. Eleanor's defense was straightforward. The will reflected Patricia's genuine wishes, executed when she had decisional capacity, witnessed and notarized properly. But 3 days before the hearing, something happened that changed everything. On November 12th, Margaret received a package at her home. It was from Daniel Westbrook. Inside was a letter. "Dear Margaret, David, and Jennifer, I've debated whether to send this for weeks. It's not my place to interfere in your family's legal matters, but I think you deserve to understand what your mother was actually trying to do. Your mother didn't change her will to punish you. She changed it because she was trying to fix a mistake she believed she'd made decades ago. In December 2018, your mother called me. She was upset. She'd overheard you discussing putting her in a memory care facility. She felt you were treating her like a problem to be solved rather than a person with agency. But more than that, she felt she'd failed you. She said she'd spent so much of her life hiding who she was that she'd never taught you to see her as a full person. She'd been Mom, but never Patricia. And now, at the end, you were making decisions about her life without really knowing her. The will was her way of forcing you to see her. She wanted you to find Eleanor. She wanted you to ask questions. She wanted you to discover the letters, the birth certificate, Ebentoire. Me. She wanted you to have to reconstruct her life and, in doing so, finally understand it. She told me, if they're going to inherit my house and my money, they should at least have to inherit the truth about who I was. The will was never about the money. It was about making you do the work of knowing her. I'm not saying this to influence your legal decision. Contest the will if you feel you must. But understand that your mother's cruelty, if that's what you want to call it, was an act of desperate love. She wanted to be known by you, even if it worth. Sincerely, Daniel Westbrook. Margaret read the letter aloud to David and Jennifer over the phone. When she finished, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, David said, "She orchestrated this, all of it. The mysterious beneficiary, the hidden past. She wanted us to investigate. It's manipulative. Jennifer sighed. Even if the intention was good, it's manipulative. Margaret wasn't sure what she felt. Anger, yes, but also a strange kind of awe. Patricia June had controlled her narrative her entire life. Even in death, she'd found a way to tell her story on her own terms. The hearing on November 15th was postponed, not because either side requested it, but because Eleanor Hastings submitted a new document to the court. A letter, written by Patricia, dated February 20th, 2019, 2 days after the will was signed. To whom it may concern, I am writing this letter to confer that the will I executed on February 18th reflects my genuine wishes and was made of my own free will, without coercion or undue influence. I understand that my children may contest this will. I expect they will. This is not because they are greedy, but because they do not understand my relationship with Eleanor Hastings. Eleanor has been the most important person in my life for over 50 years. We met in college. We fell in love. We have maintained that love through circumstances that forced us to hide it from the world. I married Thomas June because I was pregnant and afraid. I stayed married for 19 years because I believed it was best for my children. After my divorce, I chose not to live openly with Eleanor because I feared the impact on my children's lives. These were my choices. Eleanor never pressured me. She waited. She loved me without condition or demand for acknowledgement. Near the end of my life, I have the opportunity to make one public declaration of that love. This will is that declaration. To my children, I have loved you. I have provided for you throughout your lives. The money I am leaving to Eleanor is not a rejection of you. It is an acknowledgement of a different kind of love that I was never brave enough to live openly. If you are reading this, you have begun to learn who I really was. That was always my hope. Sincerely, Patricia Ann June. The letter was authenticated by a handwriting expert. It was dated and witnessed. It demolished any argument of undue influence. On November 20th, the siblings' lawyer, Arthur Brennan, called with his assessment. We can't win this, he said. The letter proves clear intent. The medical evaluation proves capacity. And frankly, the more we dig into this, the more it looks like Patricia wanted exactly what happened to happen. So what do we do? David asked. You can continue to fight and spend tens of thousands of dollars on a case you'll likely lose. Or you can accept the will and try to find some peace with what you've learned. The siblings met one last time at Patricia's house in Brooklyn. It was November 23rd. The house was cold. The heat had been turned down after Patricia's death, and no one had thought to turn it back up. They sat in the living room where they'd sat so many times as children. Jennifer spoke first. I don't want to keep fighting. I'm tired and angry, and I don't think I can spend another 6 months digging through Mom's secrets. David nodded. I agree. But I want something on record. I want Eleanor to know we're not accepting this because we agree with it. We're accepting it because we don't have a choice. Margaret was looking at the bookshelves, at the carefully organized volumes Patricia had collected over a lifetime. The first editions, the signed copies, the books she'd loved. The Price of Salt was still there, the copy with Eleanor's inscription from 1967. She pulled it from the shelf. May you always have the courage to choose. Patricia hadn't had that courage. Not really. She'd made compromises and have choices and protective decisions. She'd built a life around what she couldn't have, rather than fighting for what she wanted. But at the very end, she'd chosen. One honest thing, as Eleanor had written. Maybe that counted for something. I want to meet with Eleanor one more time. Margaret sighed. Why? Jennifer asked. Because I need to understand if Mom was happy. If all those years of hiding and compromise were worth it. They contacted Eleanor through her lawyer. She agreed to meet on November 30th at Patricia's house. Eleonora arrived at 2 p.m. She looked older than she had a month ago. The legal fight had taken a toll on her too. Margaret let her in. They sat in the living room, the same room where Patricia had spent so many quiet evenings. Eleanor looked around with obvious familiarity. I was here, you know, many times. Your mother would invite me when you were all away. I'd stay for a weekend. We'd pretend, just for a few days, that we had a normal life. Margaret could imagine it. Patricia and Eleanor cooking dinner together, watching television, sleeping in the same bed in a house that usually required secrets to be locked away. Was she happy? Margaret asked. In those moments, Eleanor smiled sadly. She was as happy as she allowed herself to be. Patricia was very good at compartmentalizing. She could hold joy and grief in the same space. But the life she lived, hiding you, hiding herself, was it worth it? Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I don't know. She believed it was. She believed she was protecting you from a difficult life. But in protecting you, she denied herself. And I think, in the end, she regretted that. The letter she left, the will, it was her way of telling the truth. Yes, though I argued against it. I told her it would hurt you. She said you'd been hurt more by not knowing her. That living with the truth, however painful, was better than living with a carefully constructed lie. Do you believe that? Margaret asked. Eleanor looked at her directly. I don't know. I loved your mother for 53 years. I never had a day with her that wasn't shadowed by secrecy. Was that better than nothing? I told myself, yes. But on hard days, I wondered if we'd wasted our lives waiting for a world that never became safe enough. Margaret felt tears coming. I wish she'd told us. I wish she'd trusted us. She was afraid. Eleanor said simply, of judgment, of losing you, of disrupting your lives. Fear is a powerful thing. It convinced her that silence was love. They sat together in that living room for another hour. Eleanor told stories about Patricia, the young woman she'd met in college, who loved poetry and could recite entire passages from memory. The woman who'd cried for 3 days after giving up her baby. The woman who'd called every Sunday night, no matter what, just to hear Eleanor's voice. In return, Margaret told stories about their mother from the children's perspective. Patricia teaching Margaret to bake. Patricia attending every one of David's soccer games. Patricia spending hours looking at Jennifer's art projects, asking questions, genuinely interested. Two versions of the same woman, overlapping but never quite matching. Before Eleanor left, Margaret made a decision. We're not going to contest the will, she said. The house is yours. The money is yours. I know that's not easy, but I want something in return. What? I want the letters. All of them, the ones from Mom to you that weren't in the box. I want to read them. I want to know her in her own words. Eleanor nodded slowly. All right, I'll need some time. Some of them are very personal. They're all personal, Margaret sighed. But they're also history. Our history, and I think we deserve to know it. Fair enough. Eleanor left shortly after. Mom wanted you to have it, and that should be honored. Eleanor looked surprised. Thank you. Thank you. Margaret stood in the doorway and watched her walk to her car. An old woman who'd loved secretly for over 50 years, who'd waited in the margins of someone else's life, who'd finally been acknowledged, but only after that someone was gone. It seemed like the saddest story Margaret ever heard, and it was her mother's story. Act 6. The aftermath, the legal settlement was finalized on December 20th. Eleanor Hastings received the house in Brookline, a vacation property in Vermont, and $1.75 million in cash and investment accounts. Margaret, David, and Jennifer each received $10,000 as specified in the February 2019. Additionally, Eleanor agreed to give the siblings all of Patricia's personal effects, including photographs, documents, and Patricia's letters. It took Eleanor 3 months to fulfill that part of the agreement. On March 15th, 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning to shut down the world, Margaret received a box. Inside were hundreds of letters, Patricia's half of a 50-year conversation. Margaret spent a lockdown reading them. It was a strange experience, reading her mother's private thoughts while the world outside was falling apart. But maybe that made it easier. Everything felt unreal in those months. Discovering that her mother had lived an entire hidden life seemed almost appropriate. The letters showed a different Patricia. Funny, self-deprecating, deeply romantic. The early letters were full of yearning and hope. The middle letters, written during the marriage, were conflicted and sad. The later letters, after the divorce, were more settled but tinged with regret. One letter, written in 1995, stood out. My dearest Eleanor. Daniel came to visit yesterday. We had lunch at a cafe near the Coman. He told me about his life, his work, his fiancée. He's happy. Well-adjusted. Loved. I keep looking for signs of damage in him. Evidence that my choice to give him up harmed him. But I don't see it. His adoptive parents gave him everything I couldn't have provided. And yet, sitting across from him, I felt the weight of what I'd lost. Not just him, but the version of myself that might have existed if I'd been braver. If I'd kept him. If I'd lived openly with you. If I'd refused to let fear dictate my choices. I'm 59 years old and I'm still afraid. Afraid of my children's judgment. Afraid of the world's judgment. Afraid of my own honesty. You tell me it's not too late. That we could still build the life we wanted. But Eleanor, I'm tired. I've spent so long being two people that I don't know how to be just one. Maybe that's my punishment. Not legal consequences or social ostracism, but this. Living in the in-between space forever. Never fully here or there. Never fully honest or fully hidden. I'm sorry I keep asking you to wait. I'm sorry I'm not brave enough. But I love you. That, at least, has always been true. Yours. Patricia Marghetti read that letter 3 times. She tried to imagine what it would have been like to live that way, to love someone for decades, but never be able to acknowledge it publicly, to make choice after choice based on fear rather than desire. She tried to imagine if she would have been brave enough to make different choices. She wasn't sure. They'd been in occasional contact since November, brief emails, a phone call at Christmas. Now, she asked him if they could meet, socially distanced, outside, following all the protocols. They met in a park in Brookline on June 10th. Daniel brought his daughters. They were 16 and 13. Shy, but polite. They looked a little like Patricia, Margaret realized. The same shaped eyes. You're half-nieces, Daniel said with a slight smile. Margaret hadn't thought of it that way, but yes, these girls were related to her. Part of the family tree that Patricia had kept pruned and hidden. They talked for an hour. About Patricia. About the letters. About what happens when you discover your family history was more complicated than you knew. Do you think less of her? Daniel asked. Now that you know everything? Margaret considered the question. No, she said. I think I understand her better, which isn't the same as agreeing with her choices. But I see why she made them. Daniel Nodez. In June 2020, Margaret called Daniel Westbrook. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what we inherit from our parents. Not just money or property, but patterns. Ways of being. Your mom inherited silence from our generation. The expectation that certain truths should stay hidden. And we inherited that too. Margaret sighed in different ways. None of us are particularly good at being honest about difficult things. No. But maybe we can be better. It was a nice thought. Margaret didn't know if it was true. Eleanor sold the Brooklyn house in September 2020. She called Margaret to let her know, as a courtesy. I'm moving back to Portland, Eleanor said. This house has too many ghosts, and I'm too old to maintain it. What will you do with the money? I'm setting up a scholarship fund at the University of Maine for LGBTQ students studying library science. It'll be in Patricia's name. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She would have liked that. Yes, Eleanor said. I think she would have. Before they hung up, Margaret asked one more question, the one she'd been wondering about for months. Do you regret it? Loving her. Given how it turned out, Eleanor was quiet. Then says Aida, I regret that we didn't get more time. I regret that she was afraid her whole life. I regret that the world made loving each other so difficult. But do I regret loving her? No, never. Even though you had to hide. Even though love isn't diminished by secrecy. Margaret, it's just complicated by it. Patricia was the love of my life. The fact that most people didn't know that doesn't make it less true. After they hung up, Margaret sat with that thought. Her mother had lived a double life. A secret life. A life built on compromises and fears and protective silences. But she'd also lived a life of fierce, enduring Lao. Maybe both things could be true at once. On the 1-year anniversary of Patricia's death, August 2nd, 2020, Margaret, David, and Jennifer met at Patricia's grave. It was a simple headstone. Patricia N. Chun, 1946 a 2019, beloved mother. They debated whether to change the inscription after learning about Eleanor, beloved mother and partner. Maybe something that acknowledged the fullness of who Patricia was. But Eleanor had asked them not to. Let her be what she chose to be in life. Eleanor had said, trying to rewrite it now feels disrespectful to her choices, even if I disagreed with them. So the headstone remained as it was. Margaret brought flowers. David brought a book, one of Patricia's favorites. Jennifer brought a sketch she'd made from that old photograph of young Patricia on the beach, smiling and free. They stood there in silence for a while. Finally, Jennifer spoke. Do you think she'd be happy with how this turned out? Margaret shook her head. I don't think Mama was ever happy. Not really. She was too committed to keeping everyone else from being unhappy. That's sad, David said. It is, but it was also her choice. And I think, in some strange way, the will was her trying to undo that, to choose something for herself, even if it hurt us. They stayed at the grave for another hour. When they left, Margaret looked back once. The inscription seemed insufficient. Beloved mother, Patricia had been that. But she'd been so much more. A lover. A friend. A woman who'd given up one child and kept 3 others. A person who'd lived in the spaces between truth and secrecy, never fully belonging to either. In the end, the inheritance wasn't the house or the money. It was this. The knowledge that the people we think we know best are often the ones we know least. That every family has secrets. That love can exist in silence for decades and still be real. That courage and cowardice can coexist in the same heart. That there are no happy endings, just complicated truths that we have to find a way to live with. Margaret drove home that evening, thinking about the box of letters still in her closet. She'd read them all, but she hadn't shared them yet with her siblings. Maybe she would, maybe she wouldn't. Some inheritances are heavier than others, and some truths take time to carry. 6 months later, in February 2021, Margaret received one final piece of mail from Eleanor. It was a photograph, Patricia and Eleanor, taken in 2015. They were sitting on a porch somewhere, holding hands. Both were older, grayer, but smiling. On the back, Eleanor had written, "We had 1 week together in Vermont, where we didn't hide. She was 69. I was 70. This photo is from that week. I wanted you to see her happy." Margaret put the photograph in a frame on her desk. When people asked who it was, Seth told Tim, "This is my mother, and this is the person she loved most in the world." It was a small act of honesty, but it was a start. The inheritance Patricia Chun left her children wasn't money. It was the burden and gift of knowing her completely. And that, like all inheritances, would take a lifetime to fully understand.